70s TV flops that are actually worth watching. The 1970s was a decade of change in television. More wholesome programming like My Three Sons and the Beverly Hillbillies were being supplanted by edgier successors like All in the Family and Good Times. Cop shows got grittier, legal procedurals more intense, and romantic dramas more titillating. While still tame by today's standards, the television of the time was being changed by shifting cultural attitudes, and some just weren't quite ready for it. But while the biggest hits of the 70s were also some of its most groundbreaking and boundary-pushing shows, there were plenty of other failed shows that came and went that were just as good. While The Mary Tyler Moore Show, The Brady Bunch, and Columbo dominated TV networks, the 70s also gave birth to a number of great shows that didn't catch on at the time but have since become cult classics. Others have been long forgotten, but are better than their reputations suggest. Some of these short-lived shows were dropped due to low ratings, others because of pay or cultural backlash. So whether you've heard of these series or not, we're highlighting some of the best TV shows from the 1970s that never found long-lived success while on the air. Mrs. Columbo. The 1970s was the era of the spin-off, with networks eager to find a new hit from an old favorite. From Maude to The Jeffersons and countless others. One of the less successful, though, was Mrs. Columbo, an extension of the wildly popular detective series Columbo starring Peter Falk. That series would often mention Columbo's wife, but she was never seen, and so in came a young up-and-comer and future Captain Janeway actress named Kate Mulgrew to play the title role, airing a year after Columbo ended. In 1979, Mrs. Columbo sees intrepid news reporter Kate Columbo following in her husband's footsteps. She isn't a detective officially, but she's a whip-smart, super-savvy amateur sleuth. And with cunning, guile, and brilliant smile, she can solve all sorts of crimes. But without Peter Falk, it seems audiences simply weren't interested, and it never managed to be anything close to the decade-long hit that Columbo had been. To its credit, the network did give it a second shot despite dismal ratings in its first year, retitling and retooling the show as Kate the Detective in its second and final season in 1980. While it's true that Mrs. Columbo can't touch the quality of its parent series, there's still lots to love about it, most notably the presence of Mulgrew, who in her first leading role shows signs of the Emmy-nominated actor she later became, even if audiences couldn't quite appreciate it at the time. Hawkins. Running just 8 episodes, Hawkins was less of a weekly procedural, as it was a series of sometimes monthly mini-movies, but it did star one of the biggest names of yesteryear in the latter days of his career, as Jimmy Stewart, best remembered for movie classics like It's a Wonderful Life and Rear Window, took on the title role of lawyer Billy Jim Hawkins. Hawkins isn't your typical hard-nosed legal drama, though, largely thanks to Stewart. With the movie star's endless charisma, Billy Jim Hawkins is a country bumpkin type who hides his craftiness and guile under a thick layer of simple aw-shucks old-fashioned Southern charm. The first installment, Death and the Maiden, debuted in the spring of 1973, and later that fall it was generally twice a month that Hawkins would head back to court on some of the most grisly cases in prime time. Over the course of the 8 stories, which typically ran about 75 minutes, Stewart was joined by a number of prominent guest stars like Cameron Mitchell and Tyne Daly, as well as future star Sam Elliott. The series' biggest flaw is the rather straightforward nature of the stories, but it's elevated by its impressive cast. While ratings were never stellar, and it ended after less than a year, Hawkins was essentially the blueprint for Matlock, one of the biggest hits of the following decade. So whether you're a fan of legal dramas, Stewart, or just TV history in general, Hawkins is a must-watch. Battlestar Galactica. It may be best known today for the 2003 series that became a major hit on the Sci-Fi Channel. But Battlestar Galactica got its start in 1978. Created by Glenn A. Larson, the producer, also responsible for Magnum, P.I., and Knight Rider. The series originally starred Bonanza alum Lorne Greene alongside Richard Hatch and Dirk Benedict, the future star of the team. Set in the far reaches of space, the series opens with the destruction of the 12 colonies of Colbo by a race of evil robots called Cylons, led by the noble Commander Adam A. Green and hotshot pilots Apollo Hatch and Starbuck Benedict. The Battlestar Galactica takes command of the surviving civilian fleet. Now, the Cylons, joined by human trader Bealter John Colicos, are hot on their tail as they set out on a mission to find the long-lost 13th colony, Earth. Despite its high-profile star and the mega-producer behind it, Battlestar Galactica failed to catch on. It did manage a second season of sorts, as the show was reformatted as Galactica 1980 that aired and was set on Earth in the titular year as the heroes try to blend in with modern society. But the original 1978 show was some of the best science fiction of the era. A solid mix of Star Wars and Star Trek, with thoughtful stories, social messages, and exciting space battles. Whether you're a fan of the rebooted series or not, the original Battlestar Galactica is a real treat that transcends its failure on the airwaves. Fish. Many 70s spin-off shows were spawned from some of the most popular shows of the previous decade, but our next entry was a little bit different. A spin-off of the smash hit sitcom Barney Miller. And it launched while its parent series was still on the air and doing well in the ratings. Titled simply Fish, the series follows the adventures of Detective Phil Fish, played by the legendary Abe Vigoda. But this was no police drama. This was an otherwise ordinary sitcom about the home life of a New York cop and his wife, Bernice Florence Stanley. In the series, Fish and his wife have become foster parents to a group of children in need. Following the example of other sitcoms of the day, the series went for a diverse cast of kids, too. And the family was also joined by Charlie Berry Gordon, a child psychologist who helps the Fish clan from getting in over their heads with 5 new children. It may sound like a trite premise, but it wasn't far off from Different Strokes, another series that debuted just a year later, and that show became an all-time classic. Unfortunately, Fish couldn't survive in a crowded sitcom landscape, falling far in the ratings. So when Abe Vigoda demanded a raise, it was an easy decision to cancel the series, even though it was a solid show with a strong cast capable of eliciting lots of laughs. Ghost Story. The 1970s saw the anthology genre creep into spine-tingling horror, led by Rod Serling's Night Gallery. But there was also another spooky anthology that decade, the criminally underrated and dreadfully short-lived Ghost Story. More than a decade before The Crypt Keeper made his TV debut, the series had its own host character, in the form of Winston Essex, eerily played by Family Affair star Sebastian Cabot. Essex is the proprietor of a Gothic mansion called the Mansfield House, and from there he introduces stories of the supernatural. Episodes in the show's 23 stories ran the gamut of traditional horror stories with tales of ghostly hauntings, demonic possessions, bloodthirsty vampires, and sinister individuals with otherworldly powers. The show also featured plenty of popular guest stars, with appearances from Janet Leigh, Martin Sheen, and Angie Dickinson among others. But it wasn't just the stars in front of the camera who impressed, but also the talent behind the scenes. Among its roster of writers and story creators were Robert Bloch, author of Psycho Twilight Zone scribe Richard Matheson, sci-fi great Harlan Ellison, and Star Trek veteran DC Fontana. Hammer horror vet Jimmy Sangster also contributed to several installments. Struggling in the ratings in 1972, Ghost Story was retitled Circle of Fear for the second half of its run. But that wasn't enough to save it. And that's too bad, because it remains among the best, and one of the most underappreciated horror anthologies ever made. Delta House. In 1978, the comedy magazine National Lampoon released its first successful movie, Animal House. Directed by John Landis and co-written by future Ghostbusters writer Harold Ramis. Headlining the film was Saturday Night Live superstar John Belushi as college cut-up Blue Tarski, who led the wild and raucous members of a local fraternity as they caused all kinds of wild trouble, to the everlasting rage of Dean Worm or John Vernon. After it lit up the box office on its way to becoming an all-time classic, it came to television the following year in the form of Delta House. Landis and Belushi weren't involved, but several other original cast members returned, including Vernon, Stephen Furst, Bruce McGill, and James Wood-Duz. Stepping into Belushi's protagonist position was newcomer Josh Mostel, playing his brother, B. Lotto. While the series lacks the bite of the original movie thanks to being on network television, it's still a laugh riot, with stories that, while not as raunchy, see the gang involved in all kinds of antics, including an episode set during the Cuban Missile Crisis. But what makes the series even more compelling is the fact that it's some of the first work from writer-director John Hughes, the man responsible for future favorites like 16 Candles, Ferris Bueller's Day Off and Home Alone. Like the movie, it's executive produced by Ivan Reitman, while Ronnie S. returned to pen the opening episode alongside the original film's co-writers Douglas Kenney and Chris Miller. The series also features an early appearance from a young Michelle Pfeiffer. Space. 1999. When Otho ended its American run in syndication, that wasn't the end of the franchise. Networks obviously liked the show, even if it wasn't enough of a hit to stay on the air. While creator Jerry Anderson had originally envisioned a new series to act as a direct sequel, after Otho was canceled due to low ratings, that sophomore season was retooled into something entirely different. Space. 1999. What the series had over Otho was a pair of superstar cast members leading the charge. Mission Impossible stars Martin Landau and Barbara Bain, who were also married at the time, headlined the series. They starred as John Koenig and Helena Russell, leaders of Moonbase Alpha, a lunar research station that's thrown into chaos when a nuclear disaster sends Earth's biggest natural satellite spinning off into space. Like Otho, the show features high-quality special effects, while its impressive cast helps to make it something much more than your ordinary 1970s space action series. Like Star Trek and its predecessor Otho, the show wasn't a massive hit despite it being some of the best science fiction on television. To make matters worse, the series was incredibly expensive to produce, and while a second season attempted to retool the show to better appeal to American audiences, it was canned after 48 episodes. The Invisible Man. These days, Hollywood is always trying to reinvent a classic with a modern twist. But the trend goes back further than you'd expect, with the 1970s actually seeing a few reinventions of iconic literary works. And of that lot, it's the 1975 series, The Invisible Man, that makes our list. Loosely based on the novel by H.G. Wells, the series is set in what was then contemporary times and revolves around the exploits of scientist Daniel Weston David McCallum, whose latest experiments for the KLAE Corporation involve teleportation. But when he inadvertently stumbles upon the secret to invisibility, he decides to test it on himself, before Weston can convince the company of the practical applications of his invention. He learns that KLAE is actually being funded by the government, who will use his research as a devastating weapon. After destroying his own research, Weston mistakenly becomes permanently invisible and must use a series of fabricated lifelike masks to be seen. To fund the research needed to regain his visibility, Weston uses his newfound power to become an intelligence agent of sorts in service of KLAE boss Walter Carlson. Craig Stevens. Part fantasy, part science fiction, part spy series. The Invisible Man takes Wells' original concept in a new direction and runs with it. While it's not quite as good as the shows it's clearly influenced by it owes something of a debt to Mission Impossible. It's a fun little series more than worth watching. The Manhunter. Gritty crime dramas were all the rage in the 1970s. With movies like Serpico and The French Connection on the big screen, and plenty of police and detective dramas on television. In 1974, though, CBS tried something a bit different with the genre, going for a period piece set amidst the turmoil of the Great Depression in the 1930s. In The Manhunter, we meet Dave Barrett Ken Howard, a former Marine from Idaho who returns home after fighting overseas and decides to take up a new role as a bounty hunter. A solid procedural that fits well alongside similar shows of the era. The Manhunter follows Barrett across the countryside as he tracks down bank robbers, murderers, kidnappers, and extortionists. As action-packed as any of the decade's biggest hits, the show boasts fast-paced car chases, guns blazing shootouts, and bare-knuckle brawls. But it's also known for hosting appearances from biggest 80s stars before they were famous, including Mark Hamill, Dabney Coleman, and Tom S. Kerritt. The problem with The Manhunter, though, wasn't that it wasn't good, it's that it wasn't among the best. In a crowded field, it failed to stand out and was cut short after just one season. But if you love 1970s crime dramas, this should be right up your bullet-riddled alley.